All living things need energy to survive. Energy is needed to move, carry out chemical reactions, move some things across the cell membrane, and to grow. Glucose is either made by autotrophs or consumed by heterotrophs, but it must be broken down to use its energy efficiently. ATP is the molecule cells can use directly for energy because it releases small amounts of energy slowly by breaking off a phosphate group. Glycolysis is always the first step breaking down glucose for energy, and it produces just 2 ATP molecules. Much more ATP is produced if oxygen is available for a cell to use. When oxygen is available, after glycolysis, the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain take place. However, if oxygen is not available, the cell can undergo fermentation in order to continue producing small amounts of energy. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to compare and contrast lactic acid and alcohol fermentation, describe the purpose of fermentation, and explain under what conditions fermentation takes place. Aerobic respiration happens when there is oxygen. Aerobic means with air, so think about what happens when you do aerobic exercise. You start breathing more heavily because you need more oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, or not with air, means that oxygen is not present. Anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. There are 2 types of fermentation: lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Which type of fermentation takes place depends on what type of organism we're looking at. Plants and bacteria undergo alcohol fermentation, while animals undergo lactic acid fermentation. The purpose of fermentation is not to make ATP. It's to recycle an electron carrier called NAD+. Why recycle it, you might ask? NAD+ is needed for glycolysis. Without it, glycolysis cannot take place and no ATP can be produced. So fermentation doesn't directly produce energy. It simply allows glycolysis to continue happening. Have you ever done very strenuous physical activity and felt a cramp in your muscles? This happened because your muscles weren't getting enough oxygen, and so they started to undergo anaerobic respiration. In humans and all other animals, as well as some other microorganisms, lactic acid is formed during the process of fermentation. Some common foods are made using lactic acid fermentation. Yogurt, pickles, and sauerkraut are made using the process. These all require keeping the ingredients locked in an airtight jar during their production. Can you guess why that is? The second type of fermentation is called alcohol fermentation because alcohol is produced in the process. So yes, this is how alcoholic beverages are made. But how gross does that sound? Feed sugar to fungus and then drink the waste product. That's essentially what you're doing if you drink alcohol. Yeast is one of the most common microorganisms to undergo alcohol fermentation, but many other microorganisms undergo alcohol fermentation as well. And really, lots of these are just floating around in the air. Lock them in a container with something sugary and they'll produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. I once saved some pulp from my juicer to put in yogurt, but I guess I left the Tupperware container in the fridge too long. I didn't think it was that bad, only maybe 4 or 5 days. Airborne microorganisms had apparently gotten in, used up all the oxygen, and started to consume the sugar from the fruit. When I opened the container, I could hear the release of pressure, sort of like when you open a can of soda, but not quite as loud. I heard this because carbon dioxide is also a product of alcohol fermentation. So I tried the fruit pulp and I could taste the alcohol. I wouldn't recommend trying this. Science projects that involve leaving things in the fridge too long are never a good idea. Especially don't eat them. Another interesting application of alcohol fermentation is the making of bread. The yeast breaks down complex carbohydrates in the flour and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is what gives bread all those little holes. When the bread is baked, the alcohol evaporates. Another really cool application of alcohol fermentation is making biofuels. These are alternative sources of energy that can be used in cars in addition to gasoline. They're used making the same process of alcohol fermentation. Feed plant material to microorganisms and they produce alcohol, or ethanol as it's often called. In the United States, ethanol is made from corn, but it can be made from any plant that produces sugar or starch, which is pretty much any plant. We just use corn because we grow so much of it, and it's cheaper to build processing plants that turn corn into ethanol. Also in the United States, corn is subsidized, which means the government pays farmers to grow corn. In Brazil, where a lot of sugarcane is grown, they make ethanol using sugarcane. All of the cars driven in Brazil are able to run on flex fuel, or fuel that contains a lot of ethanol and not very much gasoline. Some cars in the United States are made to take flex fuel, but not nearly as many as in Brazil. Next time you go to the gas station, look at the pump and find gasoline called E85. This means that 85% of the fuel is ethanol. In regular gasoline in the United States, 10% of the fuel is ethanol. Burning ethanol is better for the environment than burning just gasoline for two reasons. First of all, the less gasoline we use, the less we need to depend on other countries for our energy. And secondly, plants take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. And so when we burn ethanol made by them for energy, we aren't adding any additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When we burn gasoline, we're taking carbon that's been buried in the earth for millions of years and reintroducing it to the atmosphere. So more carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere. So after this lecture, you may not have a whole lot of notes written down, but hopefully you have a lot of questions written down as you think about how interesting and important fermentation is, not just to us, but to our whole planet. So let's take a look at the 5-question quiz that you should complete right now. And here's a preview of the questions.